the way.
We achieve these goals of sustainable development around the globe.
Join us
As we
lift the lives of many,
improving human health and restoring the environment,
empowering women,
and protecting children whilst creating a
sustainable nation for.
Together, let's action to impact.
This is a very important story. The important story. In the midst of COVID-19, it's an historic opportunity to look at the facts of the world as it is, and then to focus on the solutions to some of our greatest problems. In the 75 years since the United Nations was founded, the human race has never had to face a set of challenges like we do right now. But together, we can overcome them. On the 25th of September 2015, all United Nations member states signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, a set of solutions for the biggest problems the world faces.
So this is a moment to recognize that the way we have been moving leads nowhere and that we need to change course.
There has never been a more urgent need to revive damaged ecosystems than now. Ayubowan, Wanakam, and good evening to all of you, and thank you for joining in to this critically important forum on restorative and regenerative actions to sustain Sri Lanka's ecosystem in support of taking forward the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, for Sri Lanka up to 2030 and beyond. My name is Amaya Vijayasinghe, and I will be your moderator for this forum today. සුබසන්ධ්‍යාවක් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ දැඩි අවධානමට ලක් වෙලා තිබෙන පරිසර පද්ධතීන් ප්‍රතිස්ථාපනය සහ පුනර්ජනනය කරන්නේ කෙසේද යන මාතෘකාව යටතේ අද පැවැත්වෙන මෙම සාකච්ඡාවට Facebook සහ YouTube මාධ්‍ය ඔස්සේ සහභාගී වෙන ඔබ සැමව සාදරයෙන් පිළිගන්නවා. අපේ මේ කුඩා දූපතේ තිබෙන වටිනා ජෛව විවිධත්වය රැකගන්නේ කෙසේද යන්නත් එමෙන්ම ගෝලීය challenges ගෝලීය උෂ්ණත්වය ඉහළ යාමත් සමගම ඇතිවෙන දේශගුණික විපර්යාසවලට අපි කොහොමද කුඩා දූපතක් හැටියට එන බාධකවලට මුහුණ දෙන්න කියන මාතෘකාවත් අද අපේ මේ සාකච්ඡාව ඔස්සේ අපි කතා කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. So thank you once again to all of you who have joined in. The Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, were adopted by the United Nations and its member nations in 2015. And it's a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. So this forum today has been organized by Road to Rights, which is an award-winning youth-led voluntary organization established in 2009 in Sri Lanka. And I've been very lucky to be able to volunteer and work with them through this journey as well. And it's aimed at supporting and empowering young people through creating opportunities, skills development, creativity, and innovation by taking a human rights-based approach towards peace as well as sustainable development. So I said before that the world as a whole hopes to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And if you do a very quick calculation, you realize that in fact, that doesn't leave us a lot of time at all. And it highlights that we need to accelerate and really push forward the targets that we want to achieve when it comes to peace and prosperity on a planetary level. And as you all know, we are facing many present challenges, which I will come to when it comes to achieving that goal. But today's forum in particular is part of an exciting 9-year campaign called Action to Impact, which is a newly launched multi-stakeholder national platform by the Road to Rights organization to mobilize communities and bring businesses, civil society, youth, government organizations, and academia together in achieving the SDGs and ensuring a sustainable development pathway for Sri Lanka. So we're looking today and thinking about this forum today, but we're thinking about restorative and regenerative actions, looking at 9 years ahead as well. But when we're talking today, the standpoint that we have is looking increasingly grim. I'm talking to you now on this virtual platform, mostly because of a pandemic that has been raging across our planet at the moment. Something that has completely upended our normal lives and really deeply affected especially the vulnerable populations of our world. There's more and more evidence that diseases like COVID-19 jumping from wild to human populations are actually driven by us as humans because we are destroying pristine ecosystems and cutting into the wild places left on our planet with no regard for the immense destruction or the risks, such as these diseases coming into contact with humans, that this can cause. And this pandemic has had a severe impact on Sri Lanka. And now this interacts with challenges we already had as a small island nation, faced with pollution, with ecosystem degradation and destruction that continues unchecked, and our animals, our biodiversity, different species going extinct at a faster rate than ever because of our consumption patterns. And this is coupled now with the marine devastation we have seen through the Express Pearl disaster that happened recently as well. And over all of this looming large is the umbrella or the specter of climate change challenges as well. So the forum that we have today is talking about environmental impacts, but we must understand now more than ever that the environment is linked to our economy. It is a part of our economy, it's a part of our livelihoods, it's a part of people's health, it's a part of their well-being, and it's immensely important for sustainable development in Sri Lanka, not just looking at ecosystems, but just our people and our biodiversity in general, that we realize that this cuts across all the goals we have for the country, including food security, water security, poverty alleviation, and sustainable development for Sri Lanka. So we invite all of you to really engage with our forum today and to ask your questions from us, because this forum is meant to give you, as different stakeholders in Sri Lankan society, the tools and the information you need to take action yourself and to create impact. So if you want to direct any questions to our panel today, You can do so over Twitter and use the hashtag #ActionToImpact. And if you share your questions to us using that hashtag, we can pick them up and ask it from our esteemed panel today. But right now, let's meet our panel. There is a short video that will introduce you to our panel today, and then a video following that, which will really give a picture and put a picture on the words I just painted about the critical importance of talking about Sri Lanka's ecosystems today.
Your programming. This is a national emergency. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is to take this.
I think that video really does drive home to all of us how beautiful, first of all, our island is, and the immensely rich biodiversity and ecosystems that provide services for all of us. But at the same time, just over the last 5 or 6 years, the amount of devastating disasters that we have had to face as an island. Starting, I think you saw pictures there of the Aranayaka landslides, going all the way into the current marine disaster that we're facing. So we have an esteemed panel today with us that will help navigate us through some of these issues and then tell us about some of the priorities for action when it comes to restoring and regenerating some of Sri Lanka's valuable and pristine ecosystems. I am very pleased and honored to have on the panel today Mrs. Padma Abekul, who is the Director of the Biodiversity Secretariat of the Ministry of Environment of Sri Lanka, Dr. Eric Vikramanayaka, who is the Director of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, Hong Kong, and he's also the Chairman of the Environmental Foundation of Limited of Sri Lanka, as well as Mrs. Vositha Vijayanayaka, who is the Executive Director of the Sri Lanka Youth Climate Action Network, SLICAN Trust, and all of them have had immense experiences and direct insight to the issues that we will be speaking about today. So first of all, I'd like to introduce to you Mrs. Padma Abekul, who is the Director of the Biodiversity Secretariat of the Ministry of Environment. Mrs. Padma, I'd really like to speak to you today as a representative of the Sri Lankan government and the government's own efforts to carry out ecosystem restoration in Sri Lanka and the actions that the government has already taken and hopes to take in the future, and also how the civil society, all of us, can get involved in some of the work that the government is doing. So, පාරිසරික ක්‍රියාකාරිකයෙකු හෝ වනජීවීන් සහ සොබාදහම ආරක්ෂා කිරීම වෙනුවෙන් පෙනී සිටින හෝ උනන්දුවක් දක්වන පුද්ගලයෙක් අද මේ අපේ ෆෝරම් එක අහන් ඉන්නවා නම් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ සංවර්ධනය වෙනුවෙන් කොහොමද සහභාගී වෙන්නේ කියන එකත් අපිට ඔබතුමිය අද පැහැදිලි කරලා දුන්නොතින් ශ්‍රී ලංකා රජයේ ක්‍රියාකාරීත්වයත් එක්කම මම හිතන්නේ අද අපිට ඒක ලොකු ජයග්‍රහණයක් වෙනවා ඔබතුමියගේ වචන වලින්ම ඒක අහන්න හම්බ වෙන එක. So Mrs. Padma, over to you.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි අමායා. ආයුබෝවන් සියලුම දෙනාට. මම හිතන්නේ මට මේ ලැන්ග්වේජ් දෙකෙන්ම කතා කරන්න කියලා තමයි කිව්වේ. නමුත් ටිකක් අපේ මව් භාෂාවෙන් ගියොත් අපේ ඉන්න තරුණ පෙළට මේක ටිකක් ග්‍රහණය කරගන්න ලේසි වෙයි කියලාත් මම හිතනවා. මෙතෙන්දී මම ඇත්තටම පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශය වෙනුවෙන් road to right කැම්පේන් එකට මම ඇත්තටම ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙන්න කැමතියි. මොකද මේ වගේ තරුණයෙක් කරන වැඩසටහනකට අපිට ආරාධනා කිරීම සම්බන්ධව. මොකද තරුණයන් නැතුව අපිට යන්න බෑ. මොකද අපේ ඊළඟ පරම්පරාව තරුණයන්. අපේ කාලේ දැන් ඇත්තටම ඉවර වෙගෙන යන කාලේ. නමුත් තරුණයන් අපිට ඉන්න ඕනේ මේ වැඩසටහන දිගට කරගෙන යන්න. ඒ වගේම තමයි මේ මෙතෙන්දි තියෙන ඔයාලගේ මාතෘකාව action to impact campaign. මේ කැම්පේන් එකත් ඉතාම වැදගත්. මේක ඇත්තටම ඒක හරිම වැදගත් කැම්පේන් එකක්. මොකද මෙතෙන්දි අපි තියෙන ඉම්පැක්ට් එක හොයාගන්න අපි මොකක් හරි සිදුවීමත් එක්ක තියෙන බලපෑම එක්ක තමයි අපි ක්‍රියාකාරකම අරගෙන ඉස්සරහට යන්න ඕනේ. දැන් වෙලා තියෙන්නේ එහෙම. ඇත්තටම බලපෑමක් වෙන්න කලින් තමයි අපි ක්‍රියාකාරකම් ගන්න ඕනේ. නමුත් අපිට දැන් තියෙන සිදුවීමත් එක්ක බලපෑම සිද්ධ වුණාම අපි එතෙන්දි ක්‍රියාකාරී වෙනවා. ක්‍රියාකාරී වෙලා අපි හැබැයි ඉක්මනින් ක්‍රියාකාරී වෙන්න ඕනේ. එතකොට තමයි මේ හොඳ ප්‍රතිඵලයක් අපිට ලබා ගන්න පුළුවන් වෙන්නේ. යමක් සිද්ධ වෙන්න කලින් යන්න පුළුවන් නම් හොඳයි. නමුත් අපිට බොහෝ දේවල් වෙන්නේ අපි දන්නේ නැතුව. ක්ෂණිකව සිද්ධ වෙන දේවල්. එතකොට සිද්ධ වීමත් එක්ක අපිට මූණ දෙන්න පුළුවන් නම් අපි මේ සඳහා ක්‍රියාකාරී වෙන්න පුළුවන් නම් මෙතෙන්දී තරුණ පිරිස ඉතාම වැදගත්. මොකද දරුවොත් එක්ක තරුණයන් එක්ක තමයි අපිට ඉස්සරහට යන්න වෙන්නේ. මෙතෙන්දී අපිට ඉන්න විද්වත් මඩුල්ලත් මම මතක් කරන්න කැමතියි. ડોક્ટર එරික් වික්‍රමනායක ඒ වගේම මිස් ඔෂිතා විජේනායක, ඒ වගේම මිස්ටර් මොහමඩ් අඩිල්. මං හිතන්නේ හොඳ තොරතුරු ටිකක් අපිට ලබා ගන්න පුළුවන් වෙයි දරුවන්ට වැදගත් වෙන. ඉතින්දි මම මගේ presentation එක share කරන්නම්.
Oh, thank you.
Can you see the presentation? Yes.
I think you just have to go to the beginning. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. මෙතෙන්දී ඔබ දීපු මාතෘකාවත් එක්කම ඔබ කතා කරන මාතෘකාවත් එක්කම අපි යමු environmental restorative and regenerative actions to sustain Sri Lanka's ecosystem. මෙතෙන්දී අපි අපේ පැත්ත මම biodiversity director විදිහට මම biodiversity කියන්නේ මොකක්ද කියන එක පොඩ්ඩක් පින්තූර ටිකකින් පෙන්නන්නම්. මොකද මෙතෙන්දී අපි biodiversity කියන්නේ ජෛව විවිධත්වය කියන්නේ ජාන වල විවිධත්වය, ඒකම ජීවි විශේෂ වල විවිධත්වය, ඒකම පරිසර පද්ධතීන් වල විවිධත්වය. මම මෙතන පොඩි පින්තූර ටිකක් පෙන්නුවා. අපේ තියෙන ජෛව විවිධත්වය අපිට මේ වගේ ස්ක්‍රීන් එකක පෙන්වන්න බෑ. අපේ තියෙන ජෛව විවිධත්වය මොකද ඒක ඉතාම සුවිශේෂී ජෛව විවිධත්වයක්. ඒ වගේමයි අපිට තියෙන ආවේනික ජීවි විශේෂත් ප්‍රමාණය වැඩි. එතකොට අපි මේක ආරක්ෂා කරගන්න ඕන කියන තැන අපි ඉන්නවා. මේ තියෙන ජීවි විශේෂ පැත්ත ගත්තොත් මෙතෙන්දි මම පින්තූර කීපයක් ගත්තා. අපේ විවිධ පරිසර පද්ධතීන්, හෝඩන් ප්ලේන්ස්, ඒ වගේම මේ තියෙන බූන්දල, මේ පැත්තෙන් තියෙන බූන්දල coast line එක, coastal marine area එක, මේ තියෙන අපේ knuckles area එකේ නැත මේ අපේ ඉතා වටිනා පරිසර පද්ධතියක් කඩොලාන mangrove, මෙතන තියෙන riverine පරිසර forest patch එකක්, කියන්නේ ගංගාධාර පරිසර පද්ධතියක්. ඒතකොට මේ වගේ පරිසර පද්ධති මේ පොඩි ප්‍රමාණයක් මම පෙන්නන්නේ. නමුත් අපිට විශාල ඔබ දකිනවා මම හිතන්නේ තරුණයන් දැන් වැඩ කරන තරුණයන් දන්නවා මේ වගේ පරිසර පද්ධතීන් රාශියක් අපිට දකින්න පුළුවන්. ඒ වගේම තමයි අපි අපේ තියෙන දේශීය ක්‍රියාකාරකම් සියල්ල වගේම ඒවා සම්බන්ධ වෙනවා අපි Sustainable Development Goals එක, ඒ වගේම Convention on Biological Diversity, UN Framework on Climate Change එක, ඒ වගේම UN Convention on Combat Desertification, මේ කියන global තියෙන convention උත් එක්කත් ඒ තියෙන scenario එකත් අපි බැඳිලා ඉන්නේ. එතකොට අපිට තනියම නෙමෙයි ගමනක් යන්න තියෙන්නේ. අපි සියලු දෙනාට යන්න වෙනවා. දේශීය වගේම ගෝලීය තියෙන පරිසර ප්‍රශ්න, පරිසරයට තියෙන විසඳුම් ඔය සියල්ල මොකද දැන් මේක තනියෙන් විසඳන්න බැරි තැනකට අපි ඇවිල්ලා ඉන්නවා. ඒකයි අපි ගෝලීයව යන්න වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. මොකද තනියෙන් විසඳගෙන යන්න අපිට බැහැ මේ තියෙන ගැටලු ටික. මොකද අපිට ඒ සහයෝගය අවශ්‍ය වෙනවා. ඊට පස්සේ මම මෙතෙන්ද කියන්නේ අපිට බැලුවහම අපිට මේ පරිසරය අපේ මාතෘකාවත් එක්ක ඒ කියන්නේ restoration පැත්තට පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන් හුඟක් අපේ ප්‍රතිපත්තීන් තියෙනවා. අපි ප්‍රධාන ප්‍රතිපත්තිය වෙන්නේ National Environmental Policy, ජාතික පරිසර ප්‍රතිපත්තිය, ඒ වගේම තෙත්බිම් සඳහා ප්‍රතිපත්තියක් සහ උපාය මාර්ග තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම තමයි invasive alien species, ඒ කියන්නේ ආක්‍රමණකාරී ජීවි විශේෂ කළමනාකරණය සම්බන්ධයෙන් අපිට ප්‍රතිපත්තියක්, උපාය මාර්ග සහ ක්‍රියාකාරකම් තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම තමයි කඩොලාන සංරක්ෂණය සහ තිරසාර භාවිතය සම්බන්ධ අපිට ප්‍රතිපත්තියක් තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම කසල කළමනාකරණය සම්බන්ධ ප්‍රතිපත්තියක් තියෙනවා. ඊළඟට අපි නිෂ්පාදනයක් කරද්දී ඒක කොයි විදිහටද පාරිසරික පැත්තෙන් පරිසරයත් හා බැඳිලා පරිසරයට හානියක් නොවන ආකාරයට කොයි විදිහටද අපේ ප්‍රොඩක්ෂන්ස් කරන්න කියන එකට මේ ප්‍රතිපත්තීන් තියෙනවා. මේක ටුවරිසම් සෙක්ටර් එකට, ඒ කියන්නේ සංචාරක ශාස්ත්‍රයට, සෞඛ්‍ය ශාස්ත්‍රය, කෘෂිකර්ම ශාස්ත්‍රයේදී වැඩ කරද්දී කොහොමද අපි මේ වැඩසටහන් අපේ කරද්දී අපි පරිසරයට හානියක් නොවෙන්නේ. ඒ වගේම අපි ස්වභාවික සම්පත් අපි හිතපු ජලය පාවිච්චි කරනවා නම්, විදුලිය පාවිච්චි කරනවා නම් ඒවා පිරිමැස්මෙන් පාවිච්චි කරන්නේ කොහොමද? කළ යුත්තේ කොහොමද කියන එක තමයි මේ ප්‍රතිපත්තිය, මේ ක්ලීන ප්‍රොඩක්ෂන් ප්‍රතිපත්තීන් තුල දැක්වෙන්නේ. එතකොට ඒකත් අපේ රෙස්ටෝරේෂන් පැත්තට යනවා. අපි රෙස්ටෝර් කරන්න වෙන්නේ අපි පරිසරය හානි කරොත්. එතකොට හානි නොකර යනවා නම් අපිට අපි අමුතුවෙන් රෙස්ටෝ කිරීමක් අවශ්‍ය වෙන්නේ නැහැ. අපිට නැවත ප්‍රතිස්ථාපනයක් අවශ්‍ය වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ වගේම තමයි අපේ තියෙනවා fisheries sector එකට අපි කියන්නේ sector කීපයකට අපේ මේ cleaner production ඒක හරි වැදගත්. ඒවත් එක්ක අපිට මේ හානි වෙන ප්‍රමාණය නවත්තන්න පුළුවන්. මොකද ඒ තොරතුරු ටික දරුවෝ දන්නවනම් මේ මොකක් හරි අපි තරුණ අය තමයි මොනවා හරි කර්මාන්ත වලට යන්නේ. ඒතකොට මේ කර්මාන්තයක් අපි පටන් ගන්නකොට අපි මෙන්න මේ ප්‍රතිපත්තීන් එක්ක බැඳිලා ගියොත් එතකොට අපිට පුළුවන් අපි හිතමු කෘෂිකාර්මික මොකක් හරි වැඩසටහන අපි වගාවක් කරන්න යනවා කියලා. ඒ වගාව කරද්දී අපි මෝටරයක් පාවිච්චි කරනවා නම් ඒ වගේ ජලය උකට පාවිච්චි කරනවා නම් ජලය කොයිතරම් ප්‍රමාණ වලින් අපි මේ පාවිච්චි කරන්න ඕනද කියන එකට මඟ පෙන්වීමත් ප්‍රතිපත්තියක සියලුම දේ අපි කියන්නේ නැහැ. නමුත් මෙන්න මේ විදිහට කරන්න මේවා පිරිමහින්න ඕන කියන කරුණ අපිට දෙනවා. එතකොට ඒක හරි වැදගත් දරුවන්ට. ඒ වගේම තමයි sustainable consumption and production සම්බන්ධයෙන් තියෙන policy. එතනත් වෙන්නේ අපි තිරසාර විදිහට පරිභෝජනය සහ නිෂ්පාදනයන් නොකරන හින්දා තමයි අපිට මේ ප්‍රතිස්ථාපනය ගැන restoration ගැන අපිට කතා කරන්න වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. මොකද restore කරන්නේ අපි අපේ තියෙන දේවල් අපි නැති කරගෙන යන හින්දා. එහෙම නැත්නම් අපිට restore කරන්න අවශ්‍යතාවයක් නැහැ. මොකද අපේ අවශ්‍ය ප්‍රමාණයට තියාගන්න තමයි දැන් අපිට restore කරන්න වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. ඒකයි වැදගත් වෙන්නේ. ඊළඟට අපි ගත්තාම මේ environmental policy විතර නෙමෙයි environmental action plan එකත් අපේ තියෙනවා. එතකොට මේ action plan එක ඇතුලේ restoration වලට ලොකු තැනක් අපි දීලා තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම තමයි දැන් මේ ප්‍රතිපත්තිය සහ action plan එක යථාවත් කරගෙන යනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ අප්ඩේට් කරගෙන යනවා. එතකොට මේ මේව ඇතුලේ තියෙනවා අපි restoration ඒ කියන්නේ රාජ්‍යය මේකින් අපි කියන්නේ පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශ විදියට රාජ්‍යයේ විදියට අපි මේ අපේ සැලසුම් තුලින්ම අපි මේ restoration කියන කාර්යයට බැඳිලා ඉන්නවා. ඒ වගේම තමයි අපේ ජෛව විවිධත්ව උපාය මාර්ග ක්‍රියාකාරී සැලැස්ම National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan මේ තුලත් අපි කියන්නේ අපේ ජෛව විවිධත්වය වැලියු කරන්න ඕන, සංරක්ෂණය කරන්න ඕන, ඒ වගේම තිරසාර විදියට භාවිතා කරන්න ඕන අපේ සියලුම ප්‍රජාවගේ යහපත උදෙසා. මේ සඳහා අපේ තියෙන අපි මේ ක්‍රියාකාරී සැලැස්ම තුල තියෙනවා ඉලක්ක 12. මේ ඉලක්ක 12න් මේ කෙලින්ම බලපාන මේ restoration වලට බලපාන ඉලක්ක තියෙනවා 4 8 6 7. මම ඩීටේල් කියන්නේ නැහැ මොකද තියෙන කාලෙත් එක්ක. මේ ඊළඟට තමයි අපි ecosystem restoration වල කියන්නේ මොකද්ද කියලා බැලුවොත් මෙතෙන්දි ecosystem restoration කියන එක කියන්නේ අපි හානියටපත් කරපු පරිසරයක් යථාවත් වෙන්න ඉඩ අරින එක. යථාවත් වෙන්න යම්කිසි එක්ක අපි හිතලා යමක් කරන්න ඕනේ. එහෙම නැත්නම් ඒකට යථාවත් වෙන්න ඉඩ දෙන්න ඕනේ. ඒක තමයි restoration කියන එක සරලව ගත්තොත්. මෙතෙන්දි restoration ඊළඟට අපිට පුළුවන් ප්‍රධානම දෙයක් තමයි අපිට restore වෙන්න බැරි වෙලා තියෙන මොනවා හරි බලපෑම් තියෙනවනේ. يعني by removing pressures so that nature can recover. එහෙම තියෙනවා නම් අපිට ඒක අපි ඉවත් කරන්න ඕනේ. මෙතෙන්ද උදාහරණ විදිහට ගත්තොත් removing invasive alien species, ඒ වගේම තමයි අපි soil improvement කරන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ වගේම සමහර පරිසර පද්ධතීන් මේක විශේෂයෙන්ම කඩොලාන වලට වැදගත් වෙනවා. කඩොලාන පරිසර පද්ධතීන් විශාල ලෙස විනාශ කළා ඒ පැල හැදෙන්න බැරි වෙන විදිහට ඒවයේ වතුර එන්න බැරි වෙන විදිහට ගොඩක් වෙලාවට විශ්ව කර්මාන්තය ඊළඟට ලුණු කර්මාන්තය සඳහා භාවිතා කරලා නමුත් අත්හැර දාලා තියෙනවා. එතකොට මේ කඩොලාන හැදෙන්න බෑ ඒවට වතුර එන්නේ නැහැ. ඒ කියන්නේ අපිට intertidal zone එකේ තමයි මේ මැංග්‍රූව් තියෙන්නේ. ඒ saline soil water එන්න ඕනේ, water mix වෙන්න ඕනේ. ඒවා එන්නේ නැහැ. එතකොට එහෙමනම් water circulation අපි වතුර එන එක improve කරන්න ඕනේ. ඒ වගේ විවිධ දේවල් අපිට කරන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ වගේම තමයි අපිට පැල ස්වභාවික වෙන්නේ නැත්නම් ඒ තැන්වල අපිට පැල හිටවන්නත් පුළුවන්. මේ විදිහට තමයි සාමාන්‍ය restoration අපිට කරන්න පුළුවන් වෙන්නේ. මෙතෙන්දී අපි අපේ තියෙන වැඩසටහන් කීපයකුත් මම මෙතන කියනවා. සුරකිමු ගංගා program. මෙතෙන්දි තියෙන්නේ අපි පරිහානියටපත් වෙලා තියෙන විවිධ ක්‍රම වලින් මේක කුඩු කසල එකතු කරලා ඊළඟට කර්මාන්ත ශාලා වලින් එළියට දාන වතු මේ අපද්‍ර ජලයට දාලා ගංගා හෝ ස්ට්‍රීම්ස් වලට දාලා එහෙම නැත්නම් ඊරෝෂන් නිසා විවිධාකාරයට පරිහානියටපත් වෙලා තියෙනවා නම් මේවා අපි පුනරුත්ථාපනය කරන යන දැනට යන අපේ වැඩසටහන. ඒ වගේම තමයි හුස්ම දෙන තුරු කියන වැඩසටහන. මෙතෙන්දී අපි පැල සිටුවීමේ වැඩසටහනක් තමයි යන්නේ. ඒ වගේම අපේ දේ අපි හදමු කියන එක මෙතෙන්දී යනවා අපේ පරිසර eco friendly alternative products. මේකත් හරිම වැදගත් වැඩසටහනක් වෙනවා. මොකද එතකොට අපි ගොඩක් කසල එකතු කිරීමක් සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ නැහැ. අපි මේ විදිහේ කටයුතු කරගෙන යනවා. මොකද ප්ලාස්ටික් එකතු වීම, පොලිතීන් එකතු වීම වගේ දේවල් නොවන ආකාරයට තමයි මේ කරන්නේ. ඒ වගේම තමයි කාබනික කෘෂිකර්මාන්තය. මේ රසායනික කෘෂිකර්මාන්තයත් එක්ක අපිට බොහෝ ජෛව විවිධත්වයට විශාල හානි වෙලා තියෙනවා. මොකද අපේ පොලිනේටර්ස්ලා, ඒ කියන්නේ පරාග වාහකයන්, මේගොල්ලෝ තමයි අපේ ගස්වල පළ හැදෙන්න, අපිට පළතුරු හැදෙන්න සියලු දේට උදව් කරන්නේ. නමුත් ඒගොල්ලෝ දැන් ගොඩක් විනාශ වෙමින් යනවා මේ රසායනික භාවිතයෙන් හින්දා. ඒ තත්ත්වෙන් අපිට වළකින්න මේ කාබනික ගොවිතැන ඉතා වැදගත්. මේ සඳහා ඇත්තටම අපේ සියලුම වැඩසටහන් අපේ යන්නේ තනියම නෙමෙයි. පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශය තනියම නෙමෙයි. මෙතෙන්දි සියලුම පාර්ශවකාර ආයතන, මෙතෙන්දි අපි රජයේ ආයතන කියලා විතරක් ගන්න, සියලුම පෞද්ගලික ආයතන, ඒ වගේම සියලුම රාජ්‍ය නොවන සංවිධාන තියෙනවනම්, තරුණයන් ඉන්නවනම්, මේ සියලුම දෙනා එක්ක යන ගමනක් තමයි පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශයේ තියෙන්නේ. අපි සියලු වැඩසටහන් වලදී සියලු දෙනා සම්බන්ධ කරගෙන යන්නේ. ඒතර මේ තියෙන්නේ ආක්‍රමණශීලී ජීවි ශාක විශේෂ කියන සැල්වීනියා, ජපන් ජබර වගේ ශාක හින්දා ජලාශයක් අපේ තෙත්බිමක් විනාශ වෙගෙන යන ගිහින් තියෙනවා. අර මෙතෙන්දී රෙස්ටොරේෂන් කියන්නේ මේ වගේ අපිට මේක ඉවත් කරලා යම් කිසි කොම්පෝස්ට් හදන ඒ වගේ දෙයකට පාවිච්චි කරන්නත් පුළුවන්. ඒ වගේ යම් කිසි ක්‍රමවේදයකට අපිට රෙස්ටෝර් කරන්න පුළුවන්. මෙතෙන්දී තියෙන අපි කඩුලාන පුනරුත්ථාපන ස්ථානයක්. මේ මං කිව්වා වගේ ජලය එන්නේ නැති තැන්වල අපි ජලය එන්න සකස් කරලා අපි මේ පැල හැදෙන වේගය අපි බලනවා. මැනලා මුලින් හිටපු දවසේ මැනලා එතන ඉඳන් අපි මේක විද්‍යාත්මක ක්‍රමවේදයන් අනුව කරන්නේ. දැන් මේ විදිහට ජලය අපි එන්න සැලැස්සුවාම මේ තියෙන්නේ ඉබේ හැදීගෙන එන පැල. ඒ කියන්නේ ඒවට එන්න ඉඩක් තිබුණේ නැහැ මේ වතුර නැති හින්දා. නමුත් දැන් ඒවා ලස්සනට පැලවෙමින් පුනර්ජනනය වෙමින් තියෙනවා මේ විදිහට. ඊළඟට මේ තියෙන දරුවන් එක්ක එකතු වෙලා පැල සිටවන එක. මම මෙතෙන්දි තව පොඩ්ඩක් අර නැවේ එක්ස්ප්‍රස් වල නැවේ සම්බන්ධයෙන් ගත්තත් අපි ඇත්තටම මේ වෙනකොට පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශ විදිහට තරුණයන් එක්ක මේක වයිල්ඩ් ලයිෆ් නේචර් ප්‍රොටෙක්ෂන් සොසයිටි එකත් එක්ක අපි වැඩසටහනක් කරනවා. සියලුම නර්ඩ්ස් එකතු වෙච්ච කොහොමද මිනුම් ගත සර්වේ එකක් කරලා අපි කොයි තැන්වලද පැතිරලා තියෙන්නේ මේක අපි ඇත්තටම ගත්තේ කඩුලාන සහ වෙරළ කලාපය සම්බන්ධ කරගෙන. එතකොට කොයි තරම් දුරට පැතිරීමක් තියෙනවද කියලා මේ වෙලාවේ සර්වේ කරනවා. ඊට පස්සේ තමයි අපිට ඉම්පැක්ට්ස් බලන්න වෙන්නේ. මේක නිසා අපිට එක්ක පැල එන එක වලකිනවද, මුල් හැදෙන එක වලකිනවද, ඒ වගේ දේවල් ඉස්සරහට බලන්න පුළුවන් වෙයි. අනිකුත් නැවට සම්බන්ධ කටයුතු වලදී පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශය සම්බන්ධීකරණය සිද්ධ වෙනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ විද්‍යාඥයන් සමග සම්බන්ධීකරණය සිද්ධ වෙනවා. මේ ටික තමයි මම මේ අවස්ථාවේ කියන්නේ. මොනවා හරි තියෙනවා නම් විස්තර දැනගන්න මට ඒ සඳහා මගේ දැනුමේ හැටියට තොරතුරු දෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ සඳහා අවස්ථාව තියෙවි. මම ඇත්තටම ස්තුතිවන්ත වෙනවා Road to Right කැම්පේන් එකටත්, ඒ වගේම Action to Impact කැම්පේන් එකටත්, ඒ දෙකට මම ආශිර්වාද කරනවා. ඉස්සරහටත් මේ වගේ වැඩසටහන් තරුණයොත් එක්ක යන වැඩසටහන් කරන්න ශක්තිය ධෛර්යය ලැබෙන්න කියලා සියලුම දෙනාට සුබ සන්ධ්‍යාවක්.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි මිසස් පද්මා. අපිට මේ හරවත් ප්‍රසන්ටේෂන් එක ඇත්තටම මම හිතන්නේ සමහර වෙලාවට අහනවනේ මොනවාද රජයෙන් කරන්නේ, මොනවාද පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශයෙන් කරන්නේ, මොනවාද මේ ප්‍රශ්න වලට අපිට තියෙන විසඳුම්. හැබැයි ඇත්තටම අපි අපේ තියෙන රාජ්‍ය ප්‍රතිපත්, ඒ කියන්නේ policies දැක්කොතින් programs බැලුවොතින් strategies බැලුවොතින් ඒ හැමදේම තියෙනවා. ඇත්තට මේ ගැන හිතලා තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම ක්‍රියාකාරී වෙලක් තියෙනවා ඒ ඔස්සේ. හැබැයි අපිට තියෙනවා තව ගොඩක් ඉදිරියට යන්න ගමනකුත් තියෙනවා. මොකද ඔබතුමිය කිව්වා වගේම restoring කරන්න ඕනේ ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙන නිසා. මේවා වලට degradation ඒ වගේම habitat destruction අපි ගොඩක් දකින නිසා මේ පරිසර පද්ධතීන් වලට වෙලා තියෙන බාධක ඔස්සේ ඔබතුමියට තව ටිකක් අප වෙලා අපිත් එක්ක ඉන්න පුළුවන් නම් ප්‍රශ්න වගේක් ඇවිල්ලා තියෙනවා Twitter ජාලය ඔස්සේ. මම ඔබතුමියගෙන් අහන්නම් ඒ කියන්නේ දැන් අපේ ක්‍රියාකාරී වෙලා ඉන්න තරුණ කට්ටියගෙන් තමයි මේ ප්‍රශ්න ඇවිල්ලා තියෙන්නේ. දැන් එක ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙනවා කියන්නේ කොහොමද අපි මේ තියෙන ජෛව විවිධත්වය සහ පාරිසරික අපේ තියෙන assets ඒවා කොහොමද සම්බන්ධ වෙන්නේ අපේ ආර්ථික සංවර්ධනය සහ සමාජීය සංවර්ධනය කොහොමද සම්බන්ධ කරන්නේ ඒ වගේම රජය කොහොමද ඒ තුන සම්බන්ධ කරන්නේ කියන එක ගැනත් ප්‍රශ්නයක් ඇවිල්ලා තියෙනවා. මම හිතන්නේ ඒක ගොඩක්ම කාලීන ප්‍රශ්නයක්. මොකද දැන් අපි එක්ස්ප්‍රෙස් පර්ල් ව්‍යසනය දිහා බැලුවොතින් උනත් ඒක පාරිසරික ව්‍යසනයක් ඒ වගේම ආර්ථික සහ සමාජීය ව්‍යසනයකුත් වෙලා තියෙන බව අපිට හොඳටම පෙනීගෙන යනවා. එතකොට මේ දේවල් සම්බන්ධ කරන්නේ කොහොමද? මේ ප්‍රතිපත්ති සහ strategies policies ඔස්සේ අපේ රටේ සංවර්ධනයට කොහොමද ඇත්තටම අපි ඒ මට්ටමින් ඒ high level මට්ටමින් කොහොමද අපි ඒවා ඔක්කොම එකට සම්බන්ධ කරන්න කියන එක එහෙම වෙනවද කියන එක තමයි මම ඔබතුමියගෙන් අහන්නේ අද.
ඔව් බොහොම ස්තුතියි ප්‍රශ්නෙට. මෙතෙන්දී අපිට එකක් පුළුවන් දැන් අපි හිතමු අපේ ප්‍රජාවගේ ආර්ථිකය දියුණු කරන්න කොහොමද අපි කියනවා අපි කඩුලාන මම ගමු මොකද මේ කඩුලාන ගස් කපන්න එපා. ඒවා පාවිච්චි කරන්න එපා. ඒක ආරක්ෂා කරන්න කියලා අපි මෙහි ඉඳන් කියනවා. හැබැයි කිව්වට ඒගොල්ලන්ට ඒ ගහෙන් ප්‍රතිඵලයක් එන්නේ නැත්නම් ඒගොල්ලෝ ඒක රකින්න බලන්නේ නැහැ. නමුත් අපි ඒ අයට පෙන්නලා දෙන්න වෙනවා මේ ගහ තිබ්බොත් අපිට ලැබෙන ආර්ථික වාසිය. ඇත්තටම දීවරයට දීවර කටයුතු කරගෙන යන්න මේ කඩුලාන තමයි මත්ස්‍යයන්ගේ නිජ භූමිය ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ බිත්තර දමන ඒගොල්ලෝ ඉන්න තැන්. එතකොට ඒක හරියට පැහැදිලි කරොත් එතකොට අපි කඩුලාන ප්‍රමාණය රැකගත්තොතින් අපේ දීවර ආර්ථිකය නංව ගන්න ඉස්සෝගේ ප්‍රමාණය වැඩි කරගන්න. ඒ කියන්නේ මේ කපලා අපි හිතමු සම කෙනෙක් හිතන්න පුළුවන් මේ කඩුලාන ටික කපලා දැන් අපි පුතීම විදිහට ටැංකිය හදලා ඉස්සෝ හැදුවොත් අපිට ලොකු ආදායමක් ලැබෙයි කියලා. නමුත් ඒක తాවකාලිකයි. මොකද ඒක අපිට ලොකු කාලෙ සමහර වෙලට ලෙඩක් හැදුනොත් දැන් අපේ ස්වභාවික පරිසරයේ ඉන්න සතා හුරු වෙලා තියෙනවා එන ලෙඩ රෝග ඒ වගේම තියෙන වැරදි මොන හරි නරක දේවල් එනවනම් ඒක මග ඇරලා කොහොමද ඒගොල්ලෝ යන්නේ කියලා ඒගොල්ලෝ හුරු වෙලා දෙනවා. නමුත් අර ටැංකිය එක හදන සතාට ඒ මොකුත් නැහැ. විස බීජයක් කොහෙන් හරි ආවොත් ඒක සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම විනාශ වෙලා යනවා. දැන් ඇත්තටම දැනටත් දකින්නෙත් අපි ඒ වගේ දේවල් තමයි අපි දැන් පුනරුත්ථාපන කටයුතු වලදී. ඒක නිසා ඒක පුළුවන්. ඊළඟ ටුවරිසම් පැත්ත ගත්තාම අපිට ටුවරිසම් වලදී අපේ පරිසර පද්ධති ඉතාම හොඳට ආර්ථික කටයුතු සඳහා පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන් විනාශ නොකර. එතෙන්දී අපිට වැදගත් වෙනවා අපි ඒ සංචාරකයා දැනුවත් කරන්න ඕනේ කසල දාන්න එපා. ඊට පස්සේ ඒගොල්ලෝ මේ තියෙන දේවල් අපි කඩාගෙන විනාශ කරගෙන එන්න එපා. ඊට පස්සේ නාන්න ගියාම ෂැම්පු පැකට් එක ඒ වගේ දේවල් දාන්න එපා. අන්න ඒ ආකාරයට අපි දාගත්තොත් පරිසරයත් රකින්න ගමන් අපිට හොඳ ආර්ථික පසුබිමක් හදාගන්න පුළුවන්. වෙනත් දියුණු රටවල් මේක කරනවා. අපේ එක්කෝ අපේ තියෙන විනය ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේ මොනවා හරි ප්‍රශ්නයක් හින්දා මේක ගොඩක් වෙලාවට කෙරෙන්නේ නැහැ. අපි දරුවන් හරහා අපිට කරන්න පුළුවන් නම් ඒ දැනුවත් කිරීම කළා යන්න පුළුවන් වෙනවා නම් අපිට හුඟක් ආර්ථික පැත්තට අපිට දියුණුවට අපේ තියෙන පරිසර පද්ධති පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන් පරිසරයට හානි නොකර.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි. ඔබතුමිය කිව්වා වගේම ඒ කියන්නේ ආර්ථිකමය වශයෙන් ඒ වගේම සමාජීය වශයෙන් ගොඩක් බලපෑම් තියෙනවා. අපි පරිසර විනාශය මෙහෙම මේ විදිහට ගියොතින් ඒ ප්‍රශ්නෙත් එක්ක මම තව ප්‍රශ්නයක් අහන්නම් වෙනත් පරිසර පද්ධතියක් ගැන. ඒක තමයි අපේ තියෙන tropical rain forests. ඒ කියන්නේ සිංහ රාජ්‍ය වගේ තියෙන වන සම්පත් ඇත්තටම ලංකාවට ඉතාමත්ම වැදගත්. ඒ වගේම ඉතාමත්ම බලපෑම් වලට ලක් වෙන තව පරිසර පද්ධතියක්. කාවින්ද අපෙන් ප්‍රශ්නයක් අහලා තියෙනවා ලංකාවේ අදට වෙන වන විනාශය ගැන. එයා අහලා තියෙනවා වන විනාශය වැළැක්වීම සඳහා නීති සහ උපාය මාර්ග තියෙනවද දැන් ශ්‍රී ලංකා රජය විසින් ඒවා ඉම්ප්ලිමන්ට් කරලා තියෙනවද? ඒ වගේම එහෙම දෙයක් නැත්තම් අතරම මොනවාද අපි ඉස්සරහට කරන්න ඕනේ? කොහොමද අපිත් සම්බන්ධ වෙන්නේ මේ ඇජෙන්ඩා එක ඉස්සරහට ගෙනියන්න? වන විනාශය ඩිෆොරස්ටේෂන් නවත්වන්න.
ඔව් මෙතන ඇත්තටම තියෙනවා. අපේ ප්‍රතිපත්තියේ වන ප්‍රතිපත්තියේ තියෙනවා. ඒක වන සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවත් එක්ක අනිකුත් පාර්ශ්වකාර ආයතන තමයි ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්නේ. ඒ වගේම තමයි වන ආඥාපනත තියෙනවා. වන ආඥාපනත කියන්නේ දැඩි නීති රීති ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න පුළුවන් පනතක්. මේ ඇත්තේ වනාන්තර විනාශ කරන අයට දඬුවම් කරන්නත් පුළුවන්. මෙතෙන්දි තියෙන ප්‍රශ්නේ දැන් වනාන්තර කිව්වහම අපි දැන් මේ වනාන්තරය රජයේ ආයතනයක් සතු වෙනවා නම් වන සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවේ මේ කළමනාකරණයට ඒ පනත මගින් කළමනාකරණය කළ හැකි මට්ටමේ තියෙනවා නම් තමයි අපිට බලපෑමක් කරන්න පුළුවන් වෙන්නේ. මොකද සමහර වනාන්තර ඉඩම් තියෙනවා පෞද්ගලික අය සතුව. එතකොට එයාට දැන් මගේ ගේ තියෙන ඉඩමට වෙන කාටවත් මුකුත් කරන්න බෑනේ. මම ගහක් හිටෙව්වත් ගහක් කැපුවත් අපිට ඒකට බලපෑමක් කරන්න බෑ. අන්න ඒ වගේ ඉඩම් තියෙනවා. සමහර අයට ලොකු ඉඩම් තියෙනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ එතකොට ඒක අපිට අපි හිතමු 4-5 දෙනෙකුට ඉඩමක් තියෙනවා කියලා. එතකොට ඒක අපිට බැලුවහම පේන්නේ විශාල කැලයක් වගේ. සමහර විට සිංහරාජ වනාන්තරයට මායිම් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. සමහර විට නකස් වනාන්තරයට මායිම් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි පෞද්ගලික ඉඩමකට අපිට කිසිම අපේ රජයේ තියෙන නීතීන් බලපවත්වන්න බැහැ. ඒ පනත් යද්දී මොකද පාරිසරික පනතෙන් තියෙනවා පරිසර සංවේදී ප්‍රදේශ පරිසර ආරක්ෂණ ප්‍රදේශ ප්‍රකාශයටපත් කරන්න පුළුවන්. ඒවා පෞද්ගලික ඉඩම් වෙන්නත් පුළුවන්. හැබැයි ප්‍රකාශයට පත් කරලා තියෙන ඉඩමකට විතරයි එතකොට මේ පනතෙන් අපිට ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ වගේ තියෙනවා. එතකොට අපිට දැන් එක වෙලාවකට සමහර වෙලාවකට කැලේ ඉතුරු කරන් තියෙන්නේ එයා ආසාවට වෙන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි ඒකට අපි බලපෑම් කරන්න ගියොත් කිසි කෙනෙක් තමන්ගේ ඉඩමක ගහක් පවාගෙන ඉන්නෙත් නැති වෙයි. එතකොට මේක දෙපැත්තට බලලා තමයි අපිට ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්න වෙන්නේ. මොකද ගහක් අපි හිතමු ඒගොල්ලෝගේ ගෙදර වමනාවකට ගහක් කපා ගන්න බැරි තැනට ආවොත් ගස් වවන්න නැතුව යයි තමන්ගේ පෞද්ගලික ඉඩම. එහෙමත් තියෙනවා. හැබැයි ඔය කියන විදිහට හොරෙන් රජයේ ඉඩම් වල කපන අය ඉන්නව නැත්නම් නැහැ. හැබැයි එහෙම ඉන්න අයට දඬුවම් කරන්න පනක් තියෙනවා. වන ආඥාපනක් තියෙනවා. ඒ වගේම වන සත්වහා වෘක්ෂලතා ආරක්ෂණ පනත තියෙනවා. වන ජීවි සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවෙන් ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන ඊළඟට පරිසර පනතෙන් පුළුවන්. ඒ වගේ ක්‍රියාත්මක කළ හැකි නීති පද්ධතියක් සහ ප්‍රතිපත්තීන් පද්ධතියක් අපි සතුව තියෙනවා. ඒවා ක්‍රියාත්මකත් වෙනවා. ඒ සමහර අවස්ථාවන් වල තමයි ඒ වයින් බැහැරව යම් දෙයක් සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ. එතකොට ඒ සිද්ධ වෙන අවස්ථාවල අපිට හැබැයි තරුණයන්ගේ සහයෝගය මෙන්න මේ වගේ තැන්වල තමයි වැදගත් වෙන්නේ. Taman දන්නවනම් යම් තැනක ඒ වගේ සිදුවීමක් තියෙනවනම් හොඳම දේ තමයි දැනුවත් කරන්න වන සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව සහ වනජීවි සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව සහ පරිසර අධිකාරී. ඒ හරහා ඒ व्यसනය නවත්ත ගන්න ඒ පනත් හරහා ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙන්න පුළුවන්.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි මිසස් පත්මා. මම හිතන්නේ අපි ඒක ඇත්තටම අන්ඩර්ලයින් කරන්න ඕනේ. මොකද ලංකාවේ වනජීවි දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව මෙන්ම වන සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුවත් ඇත්තටම ඒ නිලධාරීන් කොච්චර ආසාවෙන් ඒ වගේම ඩෙඩිකේට් වෙලා මේ ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ කාර්යභාරය ඉටු කරනවද කියන එක මාත් දැකලා තියෙනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ මගේ අධ්‍යාපනය සහ ප්‍රොෆෙෂනල් වැඩ කටයුතු කරද්දිත්. එතකොට ඇත්තට මේක ගොඩක් අපි කියන්න ඕනේ. ඒ කියන්නේ ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ කාර්යභාරයට තව උපකාරී වෙන විදිහට වැඩ කරන එක තමයි මම හිතන්නේ ලොකුම දේ. අවසාන ප්‍රශ්නයක් විදිහට මම ඔබතුමීගෙන් අහුවොත් ඒ කියන්නේ අමාත්‍යාංශයට සම්බන්ධ වෙන්න බැරි පුද්ගලයෙක් ඉන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි ප්‍රාදේශීය මට්ටමින් නැත්නම් දිස්ත්‍රික්ක මට්ටමින් ලංකාවේ වන සංරක්ෂණයට ඒ වගේම වෙනත් පරිසර පද්ධතීන් සංරක්ෂණය වෙනුවෙන් ක්‍රියාකාරී වෙන්න වෙනම ක්‍රමවේද තියනවාද ඔබතුමිය අපිට කියන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ කියන්නේ බොහොම අපි කියමු decentralized විදිහට මේකට වැඩට බහින්න කවුරු හරි කැමති වෙලා ඉන්නවා නම් ඒ මට්ටමිනුත් සම්බන්ධ වෙන්න පුළුවන් ක්‍රියා මොන හරි pathways තියනවාද?
ඔව් ඇත්තටම එතෙන්දී අපි පරිසර අමාත්‍යාංශය සෙන්ට්‍රලයිස් වෙලා අපි ඉන්නේ කොළඹ වුණාට මධ්‍යම පරිසර අධිකාරිය වන සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව වන ජීවි සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව වගේ ආයතනවල ග්‍රාමීය මට්ටමට යනකම් ආසන්න ප්‍රාදේශීය ලේකම් කාර්යාලයටත් වඩා එහාට ගිය ග්‍රාමීය පැත්තට යොමු වෙන කණ්ඩායම් ඉන්නවා. එතකොට දැන් වන සංරක්ෂණ දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව ගත්තොත් වන B2 නිලධාරී කියන්නේ ප්‍රාදේශීය ලේකම් කාර්යාලයකටත් කීප දෙනෙක් ඉන්නවා. ඒ වගේ කොටස් තියෙනවා. එතකොට ඒගොල්ලෝ ග්‍රාම සේවක මට්ටමේ දක්වා වැඩ කරනවා. එතකොට ඒ අය එක්ක සම්බන්ධ වෙලා පරිසර වැඩසටහන් හුඟක් ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න පුළුවන්. දැනටම සියලුම මට්ටම් වල ගොවීන් ඒ වගේම තරුණයන් පාසල් දරුවන් මේ වගේ වැඩසටහන් ක්‍රියාත්මක කරනවා. එතකොට ඒ වගේ සම්බන්ධ වෙලා ඒ කරන වැඩසටහන් වලට සහාය වීමෙන් යන්න පුළුවන්. එතන හැකියාව තියෙනවා හොඳටම.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි මිසස් පත්මා ඔබගේ මඟ පෙන්වීමට ඒ වගේම අපිත් එක්ක අද සම්බන්ධ වෙලා මේ හරවත් සාකච්ඡාව වඩාත් මම හිතන්නේ අපිට ඔබතුමියගෙන් ගොඩක් ඉන්ෆර්මේෂන් ලැබුණා කොහොමද තරුණයෙක් විදිහට ඒ වගේම තරුණියන් විදිහට ඒ වගේම ප්‍රයිවට් සෙක්ටර් එක නැත්නම් NGOs නැත්නම් රාජ්‍ය නොවන වෙනත් සංවිධාන කොහොමද මේ රෙස්ටොරේෂන් කටයුතු වලට සම්බන්ධ වෙන්නේ කියන එක ලංකාවේ ඒ වගේම ලංකාව දැනට වෙන strategies and policies ගැන අපි ගොඩක් කතා කළා. බොහොම ස්තුතියි අපිත් එක්ක අද සම්බන්ධ වුණාට. මම දන්නවා ඔබතුමියට අද අපේ මුළු වැඩසටහනත් එක්කම රැඳී සිටින්න අවස්ථාව නොලැබෙන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි පුළුවන් තරම් වෙලා අපිත් එක්ක ඉන්න කියලා අපි ඉල්ලනවා. හැබැයි බොහොම ස්තුතියි මේ සන්ධ්‍යාවේ අපිත් එක්ක සම්බන්ධ වුණාට.
බොහොමත්ම ස්තුතියි ඔබ සියලුම දෙනාට. අපිත් එක්ක සම්බන්ධ වෙන කියලා ඉල්ලා හිටිනවා වැඩසටහන වල.
බොහොම ස්තුතියි. Thank you very much to Mrs. Padma Abekun, the Director of the Biodiversity Secretariat of the Ministry of Environment, for joining us today. I'll swiftly move on, considering the time that we have, to the next panelist that we have in line for you, who is Dr. Eric Vikramanayaka. He is an individual who has had many decades of experience and direct exposure to these issues that we're speaking about today in terms of ecosystem restoration and regeneration in Sri Lanka. He is the director of wildlife and wetlands for WWF based in Hong Kong. And he's also the chairman of the Environmental Foundation Limited in Sri Lanka. He's worked as a consultant for many organizations, including the Asian Development Bank, and he's also a biodiversity and landscape conservation specialist. So it's a real pleasure and honor for us to have you here with us today, this evening, Dr. Eric. And I think I'll ask you to just take us through once again. I think Mrs. Abekun also really touched on the important and valuable yet vulnerable ecosystems that we have here in Sri Lanka. But from your point of view as well, what are the real alarm bells that are sounding right now for the ecosystems of Sri Lanka, and what are the really vulnerable areas you see when it comes to the priorities that are there in terms of restoration and regeneration? And I think you'll be bringing in insights from the latest IPCC report that came out as well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But over to you, Dr. Eric, and to take us through this topic.
Thank you, Amaya. And Mrs. Abekun is a tough act to follow, so let me see if I can do some justice to what you asked me to do. If I can start by sharing my screen and give you a brief presentation. And this is also going to be a challenge for me. Let's see if I can. All right.
Are you able to just
Yeah,
share?
I think it's coming online.
Right, it's perfect.
Apologies. Technology is a bit of a challenge.
No problem at all. It's looking good, and you can see it up on the screen now.
All right. Are you seeing the meeting presentation mode?
Yes, I think that this should be it.
Okay.
Yes.
Is it on presentation mode now? Or no?
Yes, I think it is, and we can see your presentation. You
Now?
can start.
Okay,
yes.
Good. All right. So they looked into the future, and then they decided that it was really scary. It was very, very scary. So I think we need to start with this. Last week, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released the latest report, and it flags a code red for survival of humanity, and it alerts us to the increasingly extreme heat waves and droughts and floods and the possibility that a key temperature threshold, 1.5 degrees Celsius, could be exceeded in just 10 years unless we take extreme measures now. Over the past 50 years, for instance, global surface temperatures have risen faster than in any other 50-year period over the past 2,000 years. And last month was supposed to be the warmest in the history of recorded temperatures. And remember that this panel is an intergovernmental panel, and the report, which had to be arrived at by consensus. So it's very, very conservative. The real situation, I'm sure, is probably very much worse than what's reported here. This is these basically screen grabs that I took just a couple of weeks ago for another talk. And it indicates that this warming is that severe storms and droughts that are causing massive floods and fires all over the world are happening now, from both Americas to Europe and Asia, and we're already in the middle of a global crisis. So unless we make really deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, and we take urgent and extreme and committed actions to mitigate climate change, we are going to be in big trouble. Because these disasters are going to displace hundreds of thousands of people, and these numbers will soon swell to millions. They will lose their livelihoods, lives will be lost, and survivors will not have a certain, secure, and stable future. Amaya, are the slides advancing?
I was just about to interrupt you there, Dr. Eric. I don't think so. I think they're not advancing as you are speaking. So I hope Kasun can help us with this. But you are on slide 3 now, and I think we are still seeing.
All right.
Slide.
I'm sorry. Let me.
Perhaps we can go on, because right now I see that slide 1
okay,
can
slide 1 can be seen, right?
If you try advancing now, bear with us a moment, everyone, while we get the presentation up. I think Kasun can advance on your behalf, Dr. Eric, if you just
okay, how about now? Are you
just let him know when you want to advance to the next slide, and he will move the slides for you.
Yeah,
so we can.
But can you make it in presentation mode? Is what I'm asking.
Let's see. Is it possible for you to take over from the presentation, Kasun? Yes, he can. Yes.
Okay. So Kasun, if you can go to slide 3.
Yeah, so let's go to slide 3 now, Kasun, and then Dr. Eric will give you the cue to keep moving forward. Just give us a moment, Dr. Eric, while that comes. And we ask everyone who is in our audience as well. No problem at all. This is the thing with technology and different platforms. Just see whether you can advance it now, Dr. Eric. If you do it yourself, you might be able to actually. I think the presentation mode has changed. So just advance to the 3rd slide. Yourself. Yeah, just go to the next one there.
Okay.
There you go. And that's visible to all of us now. Perfect.
Okay. So as I said, these disasters are going to displace hundreds of thousands of people. And these numbers are soon going to swell to millions. They will lose their livelihoods, their lives will certainly be lost, and survivors will not have a certain, secure, and stable future. And it's going to create societies of climate refugees with no place to go, but trying to get somewhere that is relatively safer. And in looking for these safe havens, they will begin to move across landscapes, crossing international boundaries. And in doing so, they will cause more environmental degradation. That was the cause of the climate crisis in the first place. But desperate people do desperate things to survive. So here's the real face of climate change. It's going to be chaos, violence, and conflict. There will be conflict as people compete for scarce resources, for food, for water, space to live in, jobs, livelihoods. They will compete with people who already live in these places. Now, if this is meant to scare you or alarm you, it's meant to, because we should be scared, we should be alarmed. And if you have children or grandchildren or plan to, be even more scared for them. I certainly am. Okay, so what's happening in Sri Lanka and what can we do? Well, the National Adaptation Plan for Climate Change predicted that the same trends that are happening globally will happen in Sri Lanka as well. There will be a general increasing trend in temperature. We can expect more extreme weather events, stronger, more frequent rainfall events and storms, and these will be interspersed with prolonged droughts. The predictable monsoons that we were used to will no longer be predictable. This is significant because a lot of our activities and actions are tied to this predictability, including our livelihoods, whether it's farmers who rely on monsoons to plant or harvest, or to you, or planning your next vacation or even an outdoor wedding. Now, the last may sound trivial, but think about the investment in these activities and the livelihoods that can be affected. It's your savings, it's your future, it's your survival and happiness, right? So the impacts of climate change are being manifested now. We are seeing floods and droughts that hit different parts of the country, sometimes in the same time of the year in different places in the country. Look back at what's been happening in the past several years. We are used to looking at these floods and droughts as individual events, just one at a time. But you have to look at the trends to see what's really happening. So here's the face of climate change in Sri Lanka. Farmers who lose their crops because of severe droughts. Some commit suicide because they are unable to repay their debts. People flooded out and displaced because of floods. Livelihoods and lives are lost. Infrastructure built at expense, with great expense, and with public money, your money, and debt is drowning. So we are seeing a recurring pattern here of frequent and extreme natural disasters that are causing havoc throughout the country. So welcome to the future. It's now. And all this is taking a huge economic toll on development and growth. And that's going to affect all of us. Now, this is not sustainable and does not look good for stable governance going forward. Can we afford 60 billion rupees a year to deal with the consequences of these disasters? Look at the socio-economic and political situation in the country now. We are being pushed to the brink of a tipping point where the country will have to deal with chaos and conflict once again. So be scared. Be real scared of the future. We have to adapt, but that's not enough. Adaptation is not enough. We have to build resilience and contribute to climate mitigation as well. So what do we do? How can we build that resilience to develop adaptation strategies and contribute to climate mitigation? One key strategy is to use nature as a defense and as an adaptation strategy and a climate mitigation tool. It's this very same nature that we have destroyed and degraded and continue to do so that brought us to this state. So let's build back better with nature-based solutions. So we have already lost most of our forested ecosystems, and almost all our coral reefs and mangroves that are so important for coastal defenses have been removed. Rivers and streams are being diverted and dammed and degraded. And we are still losing over 8,000 hectares of forest every year. There is now a move to release some of the precious forests that are left, forests that will be important to save the country from this crisis for other development. It's crazy. The politicians are quite blind to the crisis we are in. Or they realize it, but they really don't care because they are only concerned about themselves. So the priorities for protection and conservation should be the rainforest in the southwestern quarter of the island and the montane forest. All of these forests are now very highly fragmented. Most were converted starting from about 200 years ago when they became a giant tea estate or plantation for the British. But that practice is being still supported today, except now it's for the Middle East and Eastern Europe. These rainforests support our most valuable biodiversity, the endemic species. If they are lost from these rainforests, they're wiped off the face of this earth. Now, while most people are focused on leopards and elephants and bears in the dry zone, the small endemic rainforest species fly under their radar, unnoticed and invisible. So we need to focus on protecting the few remaining rainforest patches and the biodiversity in them. But these forests are also so critically important for the ecosystem services they deliver. Forested watersheds ensure we have a sustained water supply throughout the year. They mitigate floods, they prevent landslides, and basically tackling natural disasters that can cause severe economic losses and loss of lives. And they also build resilience against climate change. Most of our natural wetlands, like the swamps, the marshes, etc., have been converted to agricultural areas now. Since the 1980s, most of Sri Lanka's mangroves along the coastlines were cleared for prawn farming, as Mrs. Abekwan pointed out. But after about 3 to 5 years of operation, disease sets in. They were abandoned, and they created a devastated swathes of vulnerable coastlines with no hope for regeneration. Recently, Sri Lanka was actually commended by the global community for pledging to protect all the remaining mangroves. But the reality is that there are still plans to clear these remaining mangroves for, guess what? For shrimp farms. So we haven't learned lessons from the past. And yet the mangroves are so very important, as Mrs. Padma Bekwan said, as nurseries for fish and shellfish that support artisanal fisheries offshore. They're also really, really important for sequestering blue carbon. And there are studies that have shown that mangroves can sequester up to 4 times more carbon than rainforests. They protect our shorelines and coastal areas from severe storms and wave surges, which are expected to become more frequent and more severe because of climate change. And then there are the oceans. We are an island, but as an island, we should be utterly embarrassed by our current marine protected area system. The existing marine protected area system consists of just a few small, degraded, dead and dying coral reefs, and some don't even show up on a map at scale. But these protected areas obviously don't capture or support most of our important biodiversity. We need to do better. We need to do much better with our marine systems, ecosystem. We have to be more ambitious and visionary in our approach to marine conservation and scale it up to provide the spatial and ecological connectivity that we need for a good, robust conservation strategy. So we need to have a rethink of our conservation priorities, which are now imperatives given the existential crisis we are faced with. We know that our natural ecosystems and biodiversity are critically important for providing ecosystem goods and services. Protecting and conserving what's left is essential for building climate resilience and for saving lives and livelihoods. We have to adopt big and bold conservation solutions such as landscapes for ecological connectivity, and that includes restoring some of our degraded forests and in critical areas. We must restore forests in key watersheds and high elevations to protect our water towers and allow sustainable, regulated water supplies and build climate resilience. We have to go big and bold with our big blue, the oceans. we now have suggested that we declare our exclusive economic zone a marine conservation area that will be zoned through a marine spatial plan, so that you can have different kinds of uses in different zones based on their importance and priorities. We need to make the corporate sector a partner in conservation and have them change their business paradigms to include nature conservation. They rely on ecosystem services, so pay the rent and begin to develop innovative ways to make sustainable contributions to nature conservation. We are fast approaching a tipping point. We just cannot afford to, keep relying on prayer. We have to now rely on science and nature, because even the deities that you're praying to are now trying to keep their heads above water. So with that, I will end, and happy to take some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eric, for that really critically important wake-up call, I think, that you've just given everyone in terms of how devastating the destruction can be when it comes to climate change, for instance, and the fact that it's not just something in the future, but it's already here with the changes and impacts being felt right at this moment, and then bringing in the nature-based solutions discussion and how that can really be a big part and should be a really big part of how we adapt to things. We do have a few questions that have come in. A question on agriculture, and especially organic agriculture and commercialization as well. I think what's happening now is that we have these different development trajectories that have taken place in our country, where you have our ecosystems being degraded and converted from these pristine ecosystems that support biodiversity and give humans ecosystem services to those that then support agricultural activities or human settlements or various private enterprise. What do you say to the conversion? What can you say about the conversion that has taken place now, and about more sustainable forms maybe for food production to coexist with restoration and conservation, and indeed be a positive feedback into those processes?
Okay, so our agricultural techniques have not evolved. We basically rely on agricultural techniques that are maybe even centuries old, right? But in the meantime, the environment is evolving, the ecosystems are evolving, the climate is changing very fast, and we haven't kept up. So what we are practicing, what we are doing now, is basically maladapted. We need to come up with more adaptive ways to do agriculture, to try and save water in our agricultural methods. Do you realize that it takes about 5 to 8,000 liters of water just to produce 1 kilo of rice? That's not sustainable, given the fact that our monsoons are now unpredictable, and we are going to face water shortages. There are already droughts. There are advanced agricultural techniques like hydroponics, like greenhouses, that we can now bring in and introduce to farmers. Now, the farmers may not be able to afford the capital investment, but that's where we need to bring the private sector in and come up with partnerships that partner the farmers with the private sector. We just cannot go on the way that we have been. We are quite happy looking back at the past and saying we did these great things before in history. That's history. We haven't adapted. We need to adapt now, because right now we are living in a society, we are practicing livelihoods that are completely maladapted to what's happening in terms of climate change and other changes, both social, economic, and ecological.
Yes, absolutely. And I think maybe you can also then draw from your experiences working at the Environmental Foundation and the different case studies, and I know the different litigation processes that you've followed for certain cases in Sri Lanka as well, if you want to even bring in an example here, but talking about how economic development and sustainable development that ensures justice and prosperity for all people in the country have to be balanced then with environmental protection and ecosystem sustainability as well.
Okay, so let me pick up on an example or on a threat, or rather that Mrs. Abekon spoke about, the destruction of mangroves and the conversion of mangroves into fish ponds, right? As I showed in my presentation, there is now an attempt to convert the mangroves in a protected area, Beditaltevu, degazette that protected area, convert the mangroves into prawn farms, right? That's a case that EFL has taken up. But here in Hong Kong, I'm also working on a program. We are looking at a traditional approach to fish pond management that includes and involves restoring and maintaining mangroves as part of the management strategy. So the idea is to create these ponds that are still open to the outer estuary or lagoon or whatever, and allow the prawn larvae and the fish larvae to naturally populate that mangrove, shut it down, but allow some kind of water exchange, and have the mangroves feed the prawn larvae and the fish larvae that are growing up. It's a sustainable way it provides a sustainable livelihood, especially when it comes to prawn farming. It's sustainable in the sense that it will conserve your mangrove ecosystem. It will contribute to climate mitigation by allowing the mangroves to sequester blue carbon. It will protect your coastlines because of the belt of mangroves, and we know that there are scientific studies that show that the shoreline mangroves basically can decline or decrease the impact of a hurricane by up to two forces, right? So a Category 5 hurricane, for instance, can be sort of downgraded to a Category 3 in terms of the energy inshore from the mangroves. So there are all these benefits, and if we can actually replicate that model in Sri Lanka and restore those mangroves that have been completely destroyed, especially along the western coast, it's a way for the corporates to get involved as well, and for the local communities to benefit from livelihoods, for Sri Lanka as a community to contribute to global climate mitigation. So it's a win-win situation for all. But we need these innovative ways to sustain and manage nature that involves the business community, that will basically assure us a more stable future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Eric, for bringing that very illustrative example of exactly what you're speaking about here, taking prawn farms and mangroves as an example of showing what an unsustainable model looks like, the one that we've had so far in Sri Lanka. And the example you brought in from Southeast Asia, where you're thinking about a more sustainable model that, again, can be implemented in Sri Lanka. And I think that's a very important takeaway as well, that we're not thinking about reinventing the wheel in many ways. These things have been tried and tested in other parts of the world, and they could work in terms of restoration activities in Sri Lanka as well. Thank you very much for your comments and your presentation for now. We'll bring you back in for the forum and open Q&A that we will have later on this hour. But right now, we will go to the next panelist while thanking Dr. Eric for his contribution. Go to the next panelist we have in line, Wasitha Vijayanayake, who is the Executive Director of Slycan Trust. It's a think tank and an organization, a civil society organization focusing on the thematic areas of climate change, sustainable development, biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, as well as animal welfare. And Wasitha herself is an attorney at law, but she's had vast experience working with UNFCCC processes in Sri Lanka, as well as globally, and being a lead climate negotiator for Sri Lanka and a consultant as well. So thank you, Wasitha, for joining us in this discussion. And I think you will give us a few comments based on your vast experience, once again, that you have when it comes to the topic of restoration of ecosystems in Sri Lanka, as well as how it links to climate resilience. And I think, Dr. Eric, touched on the alarm bells that have been sounded recently as well when it comes to the impact of climate change on Sri Lanka. But can we focus once again on the risks for Sri Lanka, and then what you would consider are the sort of urgent adaptation or mitigation initiatives that are required? And maybe you can even give us a little background as to what adaptation and mitigation is and how that links to ecosystems in Sri Lanka. Over to you.
Thank you, Amaya. You can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So thank you very much for having me today. It's been an interesting discussion. I've been learning a lot from what Mrs. Abekon and Dr. Eric Vikramnaik have been speaking on. I would speak a bit on what our work, as well as the work of the research that's been happening at national level, have identified as risks and hazards which are pertaining to Sri Lanka. So some of the main risks that have been identified based on the key economic sectors or hazards and risks together, if I may, because I think in Sri Lanka a lot of people see hazards as risks, but this is due to the visual aspect of it, because we see the hazard, but the risk of climate can be different. I'll get to it how this differs as well. So if you look at risks and hazards, we speak on increase in temperature, floods and droughts, then biodiversity degradation that happens, which is an impact as well to some aspects such as increase in temperature, and also human activity which causes climate change. And then sea level rise and increased salinity, which impacts agriculture as well as communities and ecosystems in the coastal and marine sectors as well. So the key economic sectors that we usually find as key areas of focus would be food-related sectors, because as we all know, Sri Lanka is agricultural-driven community still, with a large group of people working, the population working, or we are all dependent on the food security as well of the country. So food security, forestry and biodiversity, and then water resources, as well as coastal and marine ecosystems. So the impacts on these communities, the sectors as well as communities dependent on these ecosystems that are relevant would be visual. And we can see this today as well. So some of these were highlighted by the two previous speakers. And how we address these are based on how we have evidence-based research, the understanding and the awareness of communities, the key stakeholders, the policymakers, the private sector, including then also civil society organizations, youth and media as well. So some of these we see in impacts on livelihoods. For example, the farmers who are feeling the impacts, the droughts and floods that impact our harvests. We faced a lot of losses and damages to agriculture, I think, in the years of 2012, if I'm not mistaken. Then there's about, I think, 2016, 2018. This was also hard felt in many areas. And then we also have these other vulnerabilities that exist as a developing country, which could relate to your health situation, the socioeconomic difficulties you may be facing, as well as other factors that play a role, different belief systems or cultural aspects or anything that relates. So we look at all the existing vulnerabilities of communities that could be exacerbated, if you say, the impacts being increased due to climate risks that we are facing. And then it has not helped that COVID-19 has also created further impacts on the same communities that might be vulnerable to the existing socioeconomic vulnerabilities. So we focus on youth, women and children as priority areas of focus, but we also see the livelihoods that are dependent on ecosystems and the needs for resources that are based on biodiversity as well as other water resources that would also have a key impact on livelihoods. So if you look at pollution and impact that happens to the marine and coastal ecosystems, then the existing climate risk could increase, and the existing risk could be doubled up by the pollution that we make, and then the livelihoods could be impacted. I think when you're looking at the express per situation, this can be one of the things that can be looked at as well. So going to what mitigation adaptation is, if we go through the processes that exist to address climate change, and then how it links with biodiversity and conservation efforts. We focus on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and this was brought in 1992, and we have currently about 197 parties who are part of this. And then the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, which is a process that is voluntarily where the countries commit to taking actions. And these are called voluntary commitments by countries, and these are termed as nationally determined contributions. And then there are also other processes like the National Adaptation Plan process, where earlier it was targeting primarily the least developed countries because they were judged as the ones having the most risk to climate change or the vulnerability to climate change. But now it's also open to anyone, and developing countries are a priority. So in the UNFCCC process, the action started with mitigation action. So the cause of climate change would be due to the increase of GHG emissions. And it was judged that we need to mitigate these emissions, so cut down the emissions so that we would cut down the impacts that we are creating to the climate. And then it was understood later that this is already impacting us, so we need to adapt. So that is where adaptation comes in. While we are creating reductions in emissions, we are also looking at adapting to the existing vulnerabilities due to climate change or the impacts of climate change. So, for example, if you're looking at developing early warning systems or taking measures that are climate friendly, sustainable in the agriculture sector, this would fall under adaptation actions. But if you're looking at cutting down fertilizer subsidies and reducing emissions, that will come under mitigation. So if both these aspects are in an action or a project, we call it co-benefits driven. That means that you would have emissions reduced as well as there will be efforts that are adaptive to the existing vulnerabilities. So these could be socioeconomic driven. These could be focusing on communities. These could be focusing on livelihoods. But since the last 5-6 years, it has been, I would say, I forget the year, but so this conversation about the losses and damages that are already there started a few years ago. The term the climate refugee was brought in, the fact that people are moving. So we do not accept that there are refugees. The term refugee does not go with international law as under climate change, but there's also the conversation that's happening that it needs to be taken into account. So for years, this has been discussed. And so the human mobility aspect of climate impacts, the need to move from certain islands, people not having resources, and then for them to lose their land of habitat as well as losing livelihoods. So losses and damages are also something that we are facing now. So some of these are not adaptable in the present context. So we cannot undo what the loss and damage that has happened. So if someone dies due to an impact of climate change, we cannot undo or adapt to that. So there is a term called loss and damage induced by climate change. And this is also one of the key areas that we focus in the processes related to climate change today. And if you look at what's happening to address these, we have the nationally determined contributions, say, for example, in Sri Lanka, which take into account all these three elements since our first submission to the UNFCCC. So not all countries focus on loss and damage as part of the commitments that may make, but there are a certain amount of developing countries and LDCs, and also maybe developed countries, one or two, or maybe in this cycle there may be more. So there's some research that Slack and Trust has done on this, which you can refer to. So that component being introduced into our NDCs show that we are trying to take efforts to move with what's the present status of what the impacts of climate change are. And in addition to this, how we take actions would need to be multi-stakeholder driven, which means that we do not leave anyone behind. And this overlaps with the discussions around sustainable development as well. And this includes the fact that civil society actors, youth, gender-based groups, private sector, faith-based groups, media need to be involved with the policymakers in planning actions, formulation of actions, implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation. So this is a key component that we need to focus on if we are to have evidence-based as well as inclusive and participatory processes to address climate change. And additionally, evidence-based action. So however much the processes are inclusive and participatory, if it's not science-driven, you might not have the expected results or we might create change that is not actually positive change. So we need to look at the science, and if there are gaps in research, we need to address it. So most of the work that has happened through the national communications in Sri Lanka, they have tried to have evidence on risks, climate risks that are impacting Sri Lanka, as well as other research that's happening, have identified certain areas that we need more research to happen on. So that could feed into the processes and have more planned actions that can be impactful. And looking at the NDCs or the national communications related to climate change, biodiversity is always a key sector. It's always focused on. And then there's also agriculture, water systems, and then coastal and marine sector. So there's a lot of these sectors, roughly around 15 to 17, based on which one you're looking at. So there's the adaptation ones, the mitigation ones, and then there's a component of loss and damage. And in the new NDCs of the country, agriculture has been looked as one which has both adaptation and as mitigation as well. Other processes that we can link our actions to, not necessarily the UNFCCC, but you also have the UN Convention on Biodiversity, and then the ongoing UN Decade on Restoration, actions under the Decade on Ocean Science, and also the Food System Summit related actions that are happening, which would drive food security related issues for the next 10 years or so and beyond, but the planning process leading to 2030. And also what we can do in our work that we do on sustainable development, including sustainable consumption and production, because the industry sector would have a lot of links to this, and industries contribute to climate change through the emissions that are made. And then we are also responsible as a community by buying things that are not climate friendly. So that's something we can look at as well. I hope I didn't take too much time. I have a few more things, but I can park it for the moment.
Yes, and hopefully we can bring it in when we have further discussion about this. But that was a really good overview, I think, of how the climate agenda, as well as the actions being taken on the adaptation, mitigation, as well as loss and damage side, link with the environment and socioeconomic development as well. And you've really laid out the risks when it comes to these aspects as well, Bosita. But coming back to the natural ecosystems of Sri Lanka and talking about the nature-based solutions that Dr. Eric mentioned within his slot as well, can you draw maybe from your own work at Slycan Trust to give us some ideas of how restoration initiatives and natural ecosystems then play a part in adaptation and mitigation?
Yeah, so thank you. Some of the work that we do focus on coastal and marine ecosystems, like I mentioned before. So mangrove restoration is some of the work we do. And here we are looking at, again, this holistic perspective of how restoration could happen, which focuses on livelihood development, so that the risk of communities going and damaging ecosystems because they want an income is prevented. And also working with private sector, which might be potentially taking actions that are harmful to the ecosystems. So there we're looking at how we can engage shrimp farmers, because some of these are not small-scale shrimp farming that happens, which impact the environment. So that's part of the work that we do. And then we are also working with communities, because nature-based solutions doesn't necessarily mean it has to be only focused on nature. Restoration needs to be connected to socioeconomic vulnerabilities and climate resilience as well, and also identifying the sustainable goals that can connect to nature-based solutions and achieving this. So there we are working with communities on how some of the actions that are taken for restoration can generate an income for them. So one thing we do is in the COVID area, where we are doing restoration efforts, the community is in part of the waste management process, which links with the conservation, because one of the key impacts that are causing harm to that ecosystem is the pollution that's there. And also people coming in and dumping waste because they think they can bring their waste and dump it into wherever that water is, so it gets hidden or flown somewhere else. So working with the municipal councils on ensuring that they are also involved, so the actions are national as well as local. And additionally, we are working in partnership with the Climate Change Secretariat in the work that's happening under the adaptation actions, the provincial adaptation plans being developed where the provinces are engaging in identifying the areas to them that are the key risks, and also where there's conservation and landscape planning as part of it. So some of the work that we do link with the SCAM project under the World Bank, which is also a government project, focusing on landscape planning and implementation of actions that focus on conserving environment or the ecosystems, as well as working with communities to have climate resilient planning processes so that we do not go back to finding incomes in a way that's harmful to the environment. So I think it's very important while we create awareness, it's also important that we give communities access which is sufficient so that there's just transition in actions that we take and that people do not lose out while we are doing conservation. So we're trying to do that in our actions. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really important point to highlight, that you have to be really aware of who the winners and losers of any action that you try to implement are, and then really try to minimize the economic damage and the harm to livelihoods that might be a part of some of these proposed strategies. So it's about really doing the right research and having the evidence, as you said, for these actions to be truly sustainable. I think before we bring Dr. Eric back into the conversation as well, there's a question that's coming from Danesh that I think you've answered and everyone else has answered, which is, as a country, how can we combat climate change in Sri Lanka? And what steps can we take to mitigate any future risks? And maybe I'll rephrase his question by asking, the we in that question could be just someone who is listening to this program right now, listening to this forum. And how can they get involved then in helping Sri Lanka combat climate change? And I also want to ask very specifically about, pushing our policymakers and pushing our decision makers to make the right choices for our country when it comes to the economic and environmental decisions that they make. How can we get involved with that?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first one. I think that's why I stopped speaking earlier. So sustainable consumption and production, I think that's something everyone can look at their individual capacity as well. So if you're looking at what you're purchasing, how much impact has it made to the environment and how it could be making an impact which is harmful to the environment, and that could be a starting process. But for this, we need labeling systems that indicate the impact. So this is actually in the process of being done, which I guess in 2022 we would be having access to. So when we buy something, we would know how our choices make an impact. That could be an individual thing. And then going towards alternative food systems, for example. So we tried to do work on how we can reduce the meat consumption and then how that creates an impact in the emissions. And this is like a big discussion that's happening globally at the moment as well. It's not that everyone is being told to eat vegetarian food, but it's just cutting down the consumption. And if someone chooses to do so, that's their choice. But it's more of a choice that we're looking at in the individual capacity that would have an impact at the industrial level as well. Because if the demand is different, then the producers would also change this accordingly. So if you're looking at food systems, for example, that's one. So we can potentially have sustainable and climate-friendly production that comes into local food systems. I think Sri Lanka is doing some efforts on this front on the policy angle now. And then there are pilot studies that are happening that is in the market as well. So there is an interest and being understanding on these options that you have, that it lies ahead for you to choose this would be important. So a lot of people need to be made aware that these are available. Sometimes it's not that people do not want to make these choices, but they do not know that their livelihood could be based on something sustainable, that the profession could be something on these sectors. So some of the work that we do with Sri Lanka Accreditation Board focuses on how the corporate sector could make a contribution also, so that the production cycles are different, the circular economy kind of comes into play. And then looking at how the policymakers and the key government stakeholders could be climate friendly solution makers. I think, again, it comes back to that fact of having evidence that indicates that for Sri Lanka to make this decision would be beneficial in a manner that's economically viable as well as environmental friendly. And for that, we need research and we need messaging that's effective. Because if you're doing 1,000-page reports and then we expect the policymakers to read them, that usually doesn't happen. So there needs to be these versions of communication that happens in an effective way with the key evidence-based solutions, not the non-evidence-based ones, and then having a trajectory of how the compounded risks, the risks that are there already in the country, say the GDP or the economic risks that we might face, and how climate change could compound and add to it. And then saying, okay, this is the option you have, and if you do this, you would have benefits in this manner, which would also be good for the economy of the country and the people of the country. So that message is important. So there's a role for all communicators, media, academic actors, think tank people like us, as well as civil society and youth mainly on the front that I mentioned before, because sustainable choices, I think a lot of things that happen are changed by the younger generation. And then if we do this for 5 years, I think there'll be a lot of changes in the younger generations to those who are at the 20 to 30 range at the moment. And I also want to make a announcement. I think a lot of people who are listening in might be youth, given that it's Restorative organized. So there's a global youth forum on climate change that's like Entrust organizers, and last year we had about 70 countries being part of this, where projects are being developed by youth and then implemented by youth, where there's support provided by different actors to engage in it. And there'll be a call coming out in early September for the new cycle. And there'll be also a call for climate-friendly entrepreneurship that's coming out, where support will be provided to those who have innovative ideas to implement an action. So if anyone's interested, if you would like to change track and do something different, or pick a profession that you want to build on your own related to climate change, do keep an eye out and apply. We'll be able to support some of your actions. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Vasita. I think that sounds like a really exciting opportunity in the first instance, the call that you mentioned, but also the importance you said of communicating correctly with decision makers and using the best means to get the message across to them without a 1,000-page report and the other methods you mentioned are really important messages, I think, for youth in the audience today and anyone really who's joining us today. So I will bring Dr. Eric back into our panel now, and we've got many questions that have come in through Twitter using the hashtag #ActionToImpact that all of you have been submitting throughout this forum. Thank you very much. And I've been picking up a few questions, but I think we will direct these questions to both Dr. Eric as well as Vasita and see their thoughts on how they see this panning out for the future in Sri Lanka. But I think Mrs. Patna as well, Mrs. Abekun mentioned about the fact that we do have environmental protection laws and we do have strategies for restoration that are there at least documented. It's there as a document and it's there as a sort of, it's been put down on paper that this is what we want to do and this is what we should do for Sri Lanka. But I think then there's this gap between writing it down and implementation and making that effective. So how do you foresee that we can enhance the effectiveness of the current laws and policies and programs that we have in Sri Lanka and for restoration specifically? And maybe I can direct that in the first instance to Dr. Eric to see what he thinks about improving the effectiveness. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Amaya. Yeah, I mean, our laws actually for environmental protection are fairly strong, but as you pointed out, it's the actual implementation that's weak. From what I mean, I hate to politicize this conversation, but I think I have no choice because given the types of cases and pleas that the Environmental Foundation is receiving in terms of environmental injustices, whether it's pollution or whether it's forest degradation or even forest loss, cutting down illegal forest loss, cutting down of forest. Most of it seems to be politically driven. As a consequence, the government officials who are tasked with protecting those environmental resources are sort of compromised in their ability to carry out their work. So there have been so many cases where they actually have come to the Environmental Foundation and told us, take action against us, take us to court because we are, facing political pressure, which we do, and that gives them cover. Right? It sort of seems as if we are working against the government, against the officials, but we're actually working with them. So we need to change the system. We need to change the system, and I think it's really important that the youth get involved because their voices need to be heard here. They need to be more dynamic. They need to take a more proactive approach and get involved in because it's their future. And I agree with Josita that we need evidence, but I think we are also facing a crisis situation, and there is a fair amount of evidence that we can now apply that. And then invoke the precautionary principle, because we don't have another 10 to 15 years to collect more scientific evidence. We have enough of that. We also have enough economically related evidence to show that that the corporate sector is dependent on sustained ecosystem services, which are losing. And corporates usually operate on a longer time horizon than politicians do, right? So they set their targets on 10 to 50 year time horizon. So they have a lot more vested interest in making sure that those ecosystem services that they depend on and sustain their economic viability and sustainability have to be invested in. Here in WWF Hong Kong, we have a department now it's a network-wide department that's called Bankable Nature Solutions. We're trying to come up with investable or bankable economic solutions that have a positive environmental outcome. So we need more such models that can be applied widely in Sri Lanka and elsewhere if we are going to have a more secure future. Otherwise, it's good. We are going to be in a lot of trouble. We're already in a lot of trouble. And as I said before, the IPCC report was put together by an international by a governmental panel, an international governmental body, and it was arrived at by consensus. And by nature, those kinds of panels are very conservative. So even though the IPCC report itself is alarming, it's actually very conservative, and the actual scenario is probably much worse than it portrays than is portrayed in that report.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Eric. And I think I'll ask Vasudha again as well, because her experience with this, she has engaged directly with the UNFCCC processes and how those trickle down, informed by things like the IPCC report, how those sort of global level conventions trickle down into national level strategy and action plans. So asking the question from you as well, Vasudha, how do we make these more effective, the plans that we have on paper? I think it is a political question, and it is a problem when we think about the political willingness behind taking action as well sometimes. And I think Dr. Eric pointed that out rightly. But how can we then increase the effectiveness of some of these strategies being translated to action in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, so I'll first start with just responding to something Dr. Wickramanayake mentioned. So I think in case it was miscommunicated or misunderstood, what I mentioned was not that there is no evidence that climate change is happening, or that Sri Lanka needs to take action, or the impacts of the industrial actions on climate change, but the fact that when we always do a gap analysis on how policies and plans could be done, or actions in Sri Lanka could happen, it's always pointed to gaps in data, gaps in certain research that is country specific as an indicator by different stakeholders. So it's more about research and development that has projections that are long term, and also not necessarily like one-offs. So there's like a national action that happens for research that could be focusing on different sectors in a holistic manner. so that actions could be driven by these research which are continuous, and the data being monitored and managed in a sense that we can project and take actions that are evidence-based. So this is something when there's a national communication that happens to UNFCCC, or there's an app that's being developed, or NDC that's developed, that recurrently comes up. So going to how the IPCC or the evidence that's there can be integrated into policies and plans in the country. So this comes in the negotiations as well, how IPCC data is taken into account, and then the countries have the decision to decide which kind of data they use, but they would refer to the peer-reviewed data if available. And then the plans, I feel there is a demand when we are accessing climate finance that we plan in a process that is having evidence and that is also inclusive. So the problem comes in when we're implementing, because once the funding is received, how the implementation happens. So there are implications. I think we're in developing countries. Any country has, and I mean, it's not necessarily just developing countries, but any country has a difficulty in implementing, potentially with a certain quota of how policymakers or the corruption or the lack of capacity would impact how the implementation happens effectively. So looking in the perspective of law and order, I feel there is a need to make the implementers aware. So starting from the policymakers, the police, the forces that implement these actions, and also the lawyers, because a lot of young lawyers work with us in their apprenticing period or in the gap between when they have done their LLB and they're doing law college. But I see very few who would go into the field of practicing environmental law. So that itself is an issue, because those who work at a certain stage doing research when they're practicing law would not embark on this topic. So that itself is an issue. Maybe working with those who are implementing laws and making them aware, and also the draftsmen on policies and laws, on more aware on what's happening in the environmental field would be important. And also looking into a collective effort of policy making, because there's this 30-day gap where the public can give comments. So most of the time we do not do this. So if we can have organized ways of providing collective inputs, then there is this option of actually saying, okay, we've looked at this, these are the issues. Because I don't think we do this. So we tried doing this for the agriculture policy, which was very well accepted. I don't know how it fed into the last process of it, like how much of it is featured, but at least civil society, youth working together, or any other group that is a stakeholder in this process, working together and submitting something as a collective input would carry a lot of weight in how the policymakers would see, rather than just individuals submitting as well. But even that submission is quite low. I'm not going to talk about how sudden policies will come into play. That's not what I'm addressing, but structured policy process, if it's applicable and the 30-day open process is there, then there is a role that all actors could play in this as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The really important point there about the fact that there are meant to be, especially for things like environmental impact assessments that happen with big development projects that take place in the country. For instance, there is this 30-day period where anyone from the public can give their opinions and input into the submissions that have been made regarding these developments. And I think that feeds really well into a question that Hansani has raised to us on Twitter, which is, to what extent can small communities contribute for the betterment of developing and managing better ecosystems in Sri Lanka, and how can they participate in that? So maybe, Dr. Wickramaнаයක, I'll ask you to speak about how some of the communities that you've been working with, for instance, have been facilitated maybe to take part in some of these processes when it comes to restoration and development.
Yeah, so small communities actually have big voices because they can take action locally. For instance, I mean, if you're talking about restoration of degraded areas, for instance, there are so many models that we can apply where small communities can reforest areas close to their village or school or whatever, or even their home gardens. We have the Candy Home Garden model that basically emulates a forest ecosystem. Structurally, it's very diverse. It supports a lot of endemic species, for instance. It also provides the owners or the community with lots of forest resources. Now, if you can expand that collectively, if you can extend that spatially to collective action, even within a small community, then you're going to basically restore a fairly important patch of forest that can connect, for instance, two other patches of forest. So the idea is to use these kinds of models to create this forested landscape, and then you restore your water supplies, you forest your watersheds, and you also then set an example for others to follow. And at the end of the day, look, I mean, convincing policymakers is not going to be easy because they have, they have a different agenda. We need to take action in our own backyard, and that's where the small communities actually matter. Then they can also, then you also have to get the corporate sector to support that. Like I said before, the corporate sector has a huge role to play. At the end of the day, I think in most countries, if not globally, it's the corporate sector that runs the world. It's not the politicians, right? So it's time that the corporate sector changes their ways and contributes to conservation for their own good, for their own future as well. And it's a responsibility. So they need to support those small communities as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, and Wasita, as an organization, once again, that works with small communities as well, do you have a follow-up comment to that?
Yeah, I'll start where Dr. Vikramanayake ended. So about conservation, which is corporate-driven, or contributions with corporate sector. So one thing, we have had support of certain corporate sectors to implement restoration actions. Something we have seen is that commitment sometimes for projects that are nature-based solutions at local level or national level, that's seen as a project which is a one-year cycle. And when it comes to restoration, it cannot be a one-year cycle, because if you are restoring mangroves, it takes a longer process. So then Sri Lankan Trust has to ensure that sustainability of this action happens, because it looks bad on us also when we engage communities, start the work, and then it doesn't follow up from there. So that is a risk that we are facing in some of our actions. It's good that people engage, but that long-term engagement is very important, and that understanding is missing at the moment, I feel, because people see it as a one-year cycle of project finance. Looking at local communities, so we worked in Jaffna, we worked in Kapiti, we worked in Gampa district, and we also work in Trincomalee and Radhapur areas on different actions that relate to conservation, so be it mangroves or landscape planning based ones. One thing in actions that are driven by communities, is important that there's an assessment done, because sometimes if you're planting mangroves, you might use the wrong kind of native variety, and then that might create issues. So it's important that there is a local forest department officer or the district secretariat that has information that would be giving information out or capacity to the local communities on what they can do in which areas, so that these volunteer actions can happen in an effective manner, which might not be maladaptive. It's always good to take action, and this enthusiasm is great. And I think it's the role of civil societies as well as government actors and other actors who are with science knowledge and restoration knowledge to make sure that the local communities receive this information as well as the benefits of what they're doing, so that the ownership of the actions are with them, and there's more motivation to go and implement these actions. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think that's really good insight there about, and I'm really glad that you brought in the issue of maladaptation as well, because you might go in with the best of intentions, but if you are applying the wrong methods, that you might end up with a situation that's worse than what you started off with as well, where you also lose community buy-in because they're frustrated by how badly implemented something could be, for instance. So that's, I think, something very important for everyone listening to keep in mind as well. We've come to the end of our session, and it's been such a fantastic forum, but I think I'll just ask both of you to maybe give quick 45-second takeaway messages, maybe. I think you've already given a lot of insight, But just as a final message, do you have anything you'd like to add? Dr. Vikramanayake, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Amaya. It's been a good session, I thought. Well, I mean, given that most of the audience is youth, I think we need the youth to come forward now. It's their future that we are working that we are concerned about right now. As I said before, you're dynamic. You have innovative ideas. You have the passion. You have the drive. You need to come up with solutions. You need to convince the corporate sector. And when I say the corporate sector has to get involved, I don't mean just through always CSR programs. I mean through actual long-term engagement. You need to get into the corporate sector and influence them from within as well. There's a lot that we need to do. There's a lot that can be done. And right now, I'm scared. Okay, I'm really scared. So let's see if we can make a difference going on from here.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you. Rosita, would you like to make some statements at the end as well?
Yeah, so thank you for this great discussion. Learned a lot and it's been very interesting. Well, one main message would be for youth, I guess I'll end it with that. Work with those who have worked in the field so you could learn on what the mistakes that have been done and how you could improve this, because we highlight the best practices, but there could be mistakes that have been done which you can work from as well. And then also collective actions. That's important, but you can also do individual actions. So if you do not have collective options, go for your individual choice and do something at least individually so you can create impact. And start looking at how your professional choice could also connect with the discussion that we had today, climate action, restoration, and making sustainable choices and promoting it. So thank you very much, and hope you all have a nice conversation going forward as well.
Thank you very much. I have learned so much just being a part of this forum today. I think we started off really well thinking about how the strategies that Mrs. Padma Abekun introduced to us as the director of the Biodiversity Secretariat of the Ministry of Environment, what the government has in place already, and then thinking about the emergency of the climate crisis as well as biodiversity loss that we're facing as a country right now, the economic and social impact it can have on all of us as well, on the well-being of all our citizens. But then very importantly, the solutions orientation that both of you have brought into this discussion have also been extremely valuable. So thank you so very much to Dr. Eric Vikramanayake, to Ms. Rosita Vijayanayake, as well as to Ms. Padma Abekun, who joined us earlier on in this discussion. Tomorrow, we will have a relevant forum once again happening as a part of the launch of this Action to Impact program, which is the business response towards the climate emergency. So I think it follows on so well with exactly what we have been talking about. So we ask everyone who joined in today to try to see if they can join in for tomorrow's forum as well, because you will have other experts who will give you further insight on the actions that you can take. But until then, we hope that you have a very good evening. You've had lots of food for thought, hopefully, about how you can be a part of restorative and regenerative actions for Sri Lanka's ecosystems going forward. Thank you once again to all our panelists, and thank you to the Road to Rights youth movement, to all the volunteers who have worked very, very hard to make this program possible and to take this action forward, this campaign forward for the next 9 years, going up to 2030, where we want to attain the SDGs for Sri Lanka. So this is just the start of the journey. And we have a few messages from our celebrity ambassadors to finish off the session today. But I will sign off for now. Thank you once again to all our panelists. And we hope that all of you have at home stay safe, remain safe in these trying times, but also think about how we can make improvements and develop Sri Lanka sustainably going forward into the future as well. So thank you and have a good night.
ලෝකේ ගෝලීය උෂ්ණත්වය එන්නම වැඩි වෙනවා. අවුරුදු 100 ගණනක් තිස්සේ ෆොසිල් ඉන්ධන වලින් මේ ලෝකේ දුවවන්න ගිය එකේ අවසාන ප්‍රතිවිපාකය විඳින්න වෙලා තියෙන්නේ අපිටයි අපෙන් පස්සේ එන පරම්පරාවට නැත්නම් අපේ දරුවන්ටයි. මේ தත්වෙත් එක්ක මිනිස් වර්ගයාගේ විතරක් නෙමෙයි මේ ලෝකේ ජීවත් වෙන හැම ජීවි කොට්ටාසයකම ජීවිත අනතුරට ලක් වෙලා තියෙනවා. මේකට තියෙන එකම විසඳුම පුනර්ජනනීය බල ශක්තිය. ලෝකෙට හානි නොවන අපිට නැවත නැවත පාවිච්චි කරන්න පුළුවන් පුනර්ජනනීය පිරිසිදු බල ශක්තිය. මමත් ඔයගොල්ලන්ට Road to Rights Action to Impact හරහා ආරාධනා කරනවා පුනර්ජනනීය බල ශක්තිය නගා සිටවන්න අපිත් එක්ක එක්කව වෙන්න කියලා. මොකද එහෙම නොකළොත් මේ යන විදියට නොදුරු අනාගතයේදී පුනර්ජනනීය බල ශක්තිය කියන එක මිනිස්සුන්ගේ පැවැත්ම තීරණය කරන ප්‍රධානම සාධකයක් වෙනවා.
My name is Renali and I support Goal 12, Responsible Consumption and Production. Now, what is Goal 12 all about? It's about using resources sparingly. It's about using things in a sustainable manner. It's about doing more with less. Think greener and cleaner. Now, I am honored to have been selected as an ambassador by the Road to Rights organization in support of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Now, in my personal life and through my business, I have always been an advocate for Goal 12. I hope to inspire, influence, and impact your lives so that you will support me on my mission. The earth is home to all of us. However, sadly, due to overconsumption, due to pollution and overuse of resources, and us living pretty selfish lives, the earth is deteriorating. Now, I hope to use my social platforms to show you how you can be a part of this. All it takes is small lifestyle choices and changes, and this can have a significant impact on the environment. I hope to engage with you through live sessions and have lots of planned activities. We can all be a part of this change. We can be a part of the change no matter how small it may be. All that matters is that we do something about it. Doing something is always better than doing nothing at all. So I hope you will join me on my mission to accomplish all the activities we have planned for Goal 12.
Ayubovan, Vanakkam, and hello. My name is Onela Gunasekar and I support climate action, and here's why you should get on board with this campaign. Anthropogenic climate change, man-made, has been affecting our Earth in so many ways. Not just global warming that you hear about, but ocean acidification, pollution, and our behaviors as consumers and producers are terribly affecting our Earth. And guess what? The clock's ticking. We don't have time. Using this campaign, I'd like to invite you to invite your friends and come along so that we can inspire change and create this dynamic difference in Sri Lanka that will hopefully even inspire the world. I'd like to see someone from Sri Lanka, or many, making progress towards climate action, because we the people have the energy, have the time, have the mind and know-how to make the best decisions that will save our Earth. Thank you for listening. Nandri and Istuti.
මූදේ සහ සාගරයේ ජීවය ආරක්ෂා කරන්න අදම ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙමු. ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ වටිනාකම් බොහොමයක් ස්වභාවික සම්පත් හා බැඳී තිබෙනවා. ඒ වගේම ගොඩබිමේ විනාශය අවසන් වන්නේ සාගර විනාශයෙන් බව ඔබ දැන සිටියාද?
අපේ රටේ ජල සම්පත හා සාගර සම්පත රැක ගැනීමට හා සංවර්ධනය කිරීමට අපි සියලු දෙනාම හැකි අයුරින් ක්‍රියාත්මක වෙමු. සාගරයේ ජීවය හා අපේ ජීවය එකිනෙකට බැඳී තිබෙන බව අපි සියලු දෙනාම දැනගත යුතු කාරණයක්.
The world and our country is suffering increasingly by the minute. We can all see the devastating effects. That's why it's so much more important that we come together, unite and raise our voices collectively and work towards a sustainable Sri Lanka. As a Road to Rights ambassador for goal number 15 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is life on land, I am committed to raising my voice using my skills, my platforms, and the efforts of the Road to Rights volunteer cohort to be able to educate, increase awareness, and create activation that can help conserve and protect our biodiversity. I would urge you to please join me in the national campaign, because there is a cohesive and strategic plan in place, and it is so much more important, therefore, for me to give it my all and my support to make sure that we achieve these Sustainable Development Goals.